our custom to sort of introduce fancy and unintelligible phrases, but a few weeks ago we introduced a term, paradigm shift, in an evening service, and a couple of weeks ago Mike in fact mentioned it. And just to remind us all, the term paradigm shift was originally introduced to describe a fundamental change in approach or thinking in the development of a scientific discipline, but nowadays it's got a more general meaning to describe any change that results in the change of an old way of thinking being replaced by a new one, a new paradigm. And this new one is something which no one would ever have thought of before, but it radically changes the way we think of things. Now, as we've been going through the book of Acts, the early church has been through several paradigm shifts. And these were not driven by people's desire for change, people got bored, or just accommodation to some other form of thinking, theological or otherwise. In each case, Luke shows that these changes in the church were driven by God, whether through trials and circumstances or by direct intervention. And after such changes, the church didn't just grow, but it flourished, and it was never the same again. Now this morning, we would look on what we could, or I would argue, was one of the biggest paradigm shifts in the early church, the conversion of the Gentiles. Now, I'm sure all of us are aware here that over the last little while, Rod, Mike and myself have been preaching through the book of the Acts of the Apostles. And we started in March 16th. And after 5 months, we've now, by the end of this sermon, will have reached halfway through the book. So you can guess when we'll finish. Now, for me, and I'm sure it's the same for Mike and Rod, that this study has been an eye-opener, that we suddenly realised what an incredible book of Acts is. Mind you, we say that about every book we go through, but this is not just another book in the Bible. It is foundational to the rest of the New Testament. Luke is not just journaling his recollections of the early church, but he is detailing, constructing a methodical presentation of the important milestones of its development. And the entire period of Acts is a little more than 30 years. And Luke is recalling key moments, most important events. We've probably had several most important events that Mike's thought most important, I've thought most important, Rod's perhaps most important, but we've had several of these and you have them all the time. And every other couple of chapters we seem to have yet another paradigm shift. Now, Luke is not just doing this. He's not just a big picture man. He's reporting key and essential details. And Rod mentioned this in the opening sermon, that these details that Luke is given are so authentic, so real, that it leaves you in no doubt this is written by someone with first-hand experience of what is going on. This is written by someone who was actually there. Now, Luke is actually also not providing us with just a storybook. It is accurate, it is reliable, and it is providing context. It's providing like a backdrop, a backstory to all the letters, every letter in fact, that Paul writes. So we learn of places, churches, people, individuals, and we may read of them in the epistles, but we will also find, more often than not, in the Acts of the Apostles as well. And this morning, for example, we're going to be looking at the churches of Galatia, which Paul writes to in the book of Galatians. And we'll be arriving at a place where Timothy was actually born and brought up. So a few weeks ago in Acts 11, we looked at another paradigm shift. This was the conversion of Cornelius. And this was, I claimed, to be one of the most important changes in the early church. And why was that? Because this was the first time the gospel had been offered to someone outside the Jewish faith. And this, remember, was nearly 10 years after Pentecost. And you might wonder, since the apostles have been told at the end of Mark to go into all the world and preach the gospel, what exactly were they doing and what were they thinking? And if you had asked them, do you believe that the gospel is for all the world? They would have said, yes, of course. But the point for them, in their understanding at the time, was that entry into the kingdom of God, into the church, was via the Jewish faith, by becoming a proselyte, a Jewish convert. Cornelius was what the Jews referred to as a God-fearer. He may have attended synagogues, but he wasn't circumcised. He hadn't adopted the Jewish faith. And so he was not a proselyte. It was good, but not good enough. And perhaps they hoped at some point Cornelius would make that step. But God showed Peter, and through him all the other apostles, that the gospel really is for Jew and Gentile. There is no requirement to become a proselyte. There is no requirement to adopt Jewish customs. And for us, it all seems very obvious. But for the apostles, raised and schooled in the Jewish faith all their lives, this was a massive step. But in the sight of God, there was no longer any difference between Jew and Gentile. Today, like I said earlier, we're going to encounter an even bigger change in the outlook of the early church, which is the evangelization of the Gentiles. Now, this all started a few weeks ago. Mike preached from the beginning of Acts 13, and he described the church of Antioch commissioning two men, Paul and Barnabas, on what was the first organized missionary endeavor ever. Now, we now refer to it as Paul's first missionary journey. And I remember my wife being at school, and some of the children were not very bright. And one of them asked, why was it called the First World War? And obviously because there was another one. And this is the first of 4 missionary journeys that Paul carried out. But of course, at this point, it was the only one. Now, from this point onwards, the book of Acts focuses on the ministry and journeys of the Apostle Paul, the man chosen by God to be the apostle to the Gentiles. Now, last week, Mike followed Paul and Barnabas on their travels, and they leave Cyprus. They sail to the province of Pamphylia, which was a region in Asia Minor, which we know today as Turkey. And going north, they strike the large regional capital of the province of Pisidia, often referred to as Pisidian Antioch. And you wonder, why do they call it Pisidian Antioch? It's to distinguish it from the other Antioch where they came from. And if you all think this is very confusing, you must realise that there are 2 Shrewsburys in Canada. There are 3 in Jamaica. And there are 5 in the US. No, sorry, 7 in the USA. And of course, 1 in Shropshire. So there you go. That's why they called it Pisidian Antioch. Now, we should have some maps coming up, and we have indeed. And this is a map just to show you where they're going. And it all looks a bit dry and sort of matter of fact. There's just some lines going from place to place. But if you think about the scale of these things, now, for some of us, we think it an adventure to get on an aeroplane and travel to another country, or even drive to another country. It all seems very adventurous and very exciting. But this is completely different. They're taking journeys up to another sort of region, another province of the Roman Empire. And Mark, could you do the next one? To give you some idea, this is a relief map. So you can see it's very similar to the other one, but this is modern-day Turkey. And you see where we are. I've got a pointer, but you see that big lake there in the middle. And below that, that is a plain, a plateau. And between that and the sea are mountains. And Paul and Barnabas are going to cross those mountains, or have crossed those mountains. And these are not like the Cambrian mountains. These are mountains which are real, sorry, to any Welsh people. These are much bigger mountains, shall I say. These are 8,000 or 9,000 feet. They are snow-capped, even in summer. And the plateau they go to was described at the time by a writer of the time to be dry, barren, and treeless. And it's about 1,000 metres. So it's as high as any hill or mountain in the Lake District, and of most mountains in Snowdonia. So this was quite a journey. This is quite an undertaking. But mind you, there are no travel lodges, there are no Ubers, there is no, Turkish rail at the time. There are no aeroplanes. They are going on foot all the way on very rough and roads which you think, which our roads aren't very good. As you drive around Shropshire, you realise that they're all disintegrating. But these were not even metalled roads. These were rocky and difficult roads. Now you might ask, what was Paul thinking? Why was he coming here in the first place? Now, some would give the idea that Paul had some kind of master plan. That back in Antioch they had some kind of war room with a big map and they were pushing things around. That they identified big cities which with lots of people in, and they'd look at the main travel routes and saying, well, we will target these areas. But there may be some truth in that. But we do know that Paul was a man led by the Spirit of God. Whatever plans he made, he was quite happy to change them. And we know that sometimes he didn't go to places because God told him not to. And sometimes he did go to places because God directed him there. And sometimes he left places of service because he felt he had other priorities had come up. But I think there's another reason. We know that Paul was told by God, we read of it in his sermon to the Jewish nation in Acts 22, that God would send him far off to the Gentiles. He knew almost from the beginning of his conversion that was what God had planned for him, that God was going to send him to the Gentiles. Paul was from Tarsus, and the map's gone, but Paul grew up in a region which backed onto this area, which was probably regarded as a bit uncivilized. He would have known that this is a bit ropey and a bit rough, the area that he was behind where he lived, in the region. And this was a natural place for him to go because he knew that is where the Gentiles really were. Now, Mike left us last week with Barnabas and Paul being expelled from Antioch. And they moved 90 miles southeast, leaving the region of Pisidia, and they go to Lycaonia. And they come to its chief city called Iconium. And nowadays there is a very large town there, probably the size of Birmingham there, called Konya. And Paul is now entering the region which we know as Galatia. And this is the area to which the book of Galatians was written to. Now, today we're going to hear what Paul did next. He's going to go much, much further than Peter did. He's going to preach the gospel, not to Jews, not just to proselytes, not just to God-fearers, but to those who are truly Gentile, those who do not know God at all, who have no knowledge of the true God, let alone worship him. And this is the gospel age as we know it. It is beginning. We've entered a new era. And he's not simply going to places where there might be Jewish synagogues or Jewish communities. He's going completely out in the wild, off the beaten track, to the complete heathen. So the chapter we have splits quite easily into 3 bits. There's Paul at Iconium, Paul at Lystra and Derbe, and Paul's return to Antioch. Now, we're not going to go by verse because the chapter's a bit long for that. And so we'll start with Paul at Iconium. And when he gets there, he starts his normal pattern. He starts off by going to the Jewish synagogue, and he does so with such remarkable force, a warmth and unction that not just a few, but many, both of Jews and God-fearing Gentiles, believe the gospel. They become believers in Jesus. And again, just as in Antioch, the Jewish authorities, those who do not believe, those who actually the word implies are disobedient, take active steps to expel Paul and Barnabas. And they attempt to discredit and prejudice them with the local authorities and the establishment. Now, for the time that they are there, and it mentions a long time, but the word also implies that sufficient time, a time which was marked out and coming to an end, that they preached, they had miraculous signs, and you would have thought that actually surely these signs alone would have convinced everyone, unbelieving Jews or not. And I've heard it said by people, I cannot understand how if people saw miracles, why they would not believe. There's a famous philosopher called Voltaire, and he lived in the 17th century, the 18th century, and he said, he was an infidel, and he said, if I was in the market square in Paris, and I saw a miracle with 2,000 people, witnesses there with me, who also saw the same miracle, I would choose not to believe it, nor the eyes of the 2,000 other people there. This is the hardness of the unbelieving heart. It doesn't matter what signs and miracles you show, they will not believe. It sounds incredible, but then, dear at our time, I have heard of people who've had almost quite miraculous experiences where they've been healed of incurable diseases. And have they become Christians? No, they haven't. Now, soon the opposition becomes so serious that the city is divided. Some side with the Jews, some with Barnabas and Paul. And there is a plot by the civic rulers and the officials and the mob to actually put an end to Paul and Barnabas. Now, they mean not to simply ill-treat them, but to stone them. And the last action would probably have come from the Jews themselves. But they are warned in advance, and they flee, not out of fear, but out of just common sense, because Jesus had said to his disciples that if they are persecuted in one city, to flee to another. And that's what they did, and they continue preaching the good news in the regions around, and they come to Lystra in the province of Lycaonia. Now, Lystra lay about 30 miles south of Iconium, and it was a Roman colony. It was a bit rough. It was used originally as a base for defending and suppressing marauders who lived in the Taurus Mountains further south. And it was 100 miles from Antioch, and it was directly connected by a Roman road, which didn't go anywhere else. It went directly from Iconium, Antioch, right to Lystra. And the site is still there today. There's no town there. There's the ruins there. And they were discovered 100 or so years ago. And this was a heathen town. There were no synagogue there. There don't appear to be any Jews there either, because when the Jews finally turn up, they've come from Antioch, 100 miles away. But despite the heathen nature of the town, Paul is able to communicate with the local inhabitants. Now, have you ever wondered what Paul was like, what it would have been like to meet him? Now, some view Paul as someone who was a bit argumentative, a bit kind of autistic, a bit difficult to get on with. You know, someone who was intolerant and would easily disagree with you. He would never give way, and he'd fall out with people all the time. But this is not the picture that we have of him in the New Testament. There is an account written a bit later of an eyewitness who met Paul in that area. And he described him. He said, "I saw Paul approaching, a man of small stature, with a bald head and crooked legs, in a good state of body, with eyebrows meeting and a nose somewhat hooked." And then he says this, "full of friendliness, for now he appeared like a man, and now he had the face of an angel." So this, you can appreciate that Paul was someone who people wanted to get on with. When we read in the New Testament later, he seemed to make friends with people, whoever he met, of all strata of society. And we see that in his letters, and we see that in the Acts, that he could foster friendships with people of all different backgrounds and class. Now, the scene is set for what is a precursor for what we see in Acts 17. Paul is going to preach to the completely unchurched, those without knowledge, and he has an incredible gift as a communicator. We see a miracle that also follows closely to that of Peter in Acts chapter 3. There is a man that they see, lame from birth, and he'd never walked. And it appears he'd never been able to stand up straight either. Paul is preaching, and he notices that this man has not just started listening, but has been intently listening all the time. And he recognizes that this man has faith. Now, our translations put faith to be healed, but actually the original says faith to be saved. And so I'm reading into this that this man had more than just faith to be healed. There was something more there with him. And he shouts to the man, "Stand up on your feet." And the man jumps up and begins to walk. Now, this, as far as we know, is the only miracle that Paul ever did there, but the effect was immediate. A large crowd of very, very excited people gather. And the reason for that, because in that area there were local stories, legends in their folklore that the gods did and come down among them and walked among them disguised as men. In fact, they had a local legend, one which involves Zeus and Hermes, who were entertained unknowingly by an aged couple in that region, and they were rewarded for it. And to these people, it looked like the old legends were coming true. And the gods really were there. And they were amazed. They were so excited. They identified Barnabas, because he's the older, graver, one who didn't talk very much, as Zeus, the king of the gods, and Paul, the younger one, who seemed to do most of the talking, and he was Hermes, the messenger of the gods. Or we don't actually know, because they were obviously not speaking. Well, we find out they were not speaking in Greek, so these were probably their equivalent gods. And they all start shouting that the gods had condescended to visit Lystra, disguised as men, and therefore the natural thing is we should honour these people. The local priest, the priest of Zeus, who had a temple right in front of the town, he started the whole occasion off. Zeus was the city's protector, and so they had festivities, and they started to bring in oxen. They decorated the oxen with garlands. They're going to sacrifice these oxen to Paul and Barnabas. Now, perhaps one of the main reasons that Lystra was there in the first place was that it was a Roman colony, and it had been populated by some Romans as a sort of military base. There could have been Romans still here, but these crowds are not Romans. They're not Greeks either. They are not speaking Greek or Latin. They're speaking a local language called Lycaonian. It's a language of the region, and the city is remote. It's a seat of raw heathenism. The people are superstitious. They're credulous. And you think, well, what are Paul and Barnabas doing? How are they allowing this? The reason is because they don't understand a word that these people are saying. They can see what's going on, and finally it dawns on them, to their horror, that these people are going to sacrifice sacrifices for them. And they are distressed by it. They try to show their distress as visibly as they can. They tear their clothes, which is a sign in those days of people expressing not simply grief, but indignation and outrage. And they ran in among the crowds, trying to persuade them, shouting, "Look, we're not gods, we're just men like you." And then they try and persuade them. But how? Should he go to Exodus 20 and say, "You should not worship me, worship us, because the Bible says you shall have no other gods before me"? These people had never seen a Bible. And so he talks to them in language that they understand. And he does this in Acts 17, where he takes what they know and explains to them what they need to know from that. So, the Jews already knew that God was one, that he was a true and living God, and that the gospel was given through his Son. These had to be taught what the Jews knew, because they didn't know it. He told them that God is one, and that he had not left himself without witness. His works of creation and providence showed that he was the only true living God who supplies the needs of all men. And by implication, these gods that they were worshipping were no gods at all, and that they should turn to the true God. This God had allowed, but not approved, Gentiles to walk in their own ways. And in spite of them doing this, he was still good and kind. And this God was giving them witness of himself. And with great difficulty, they halted the whole proceedings and stopped it in its tracks. But around this time, who should turn up? Jews from Antioch and Iconium. And they were pretty fanatical. I think they'd come 100 miles to actually chase Paul and interrupt whatever Paul was doing. These were the same ones who had organised the expulsion from Antioch and Iconium. And they incited the local crowd, who probably were a bit annoyed that this whole big festival had been stopped. These apostles had refused to accept divine honours and dishonoured their gods. And they perhaps resented Paul because he was, after all, the chief speaker. In fact, Paul had made them look idiots, really. They had basically started worshipping these people, and then they were told, actually, by the way, these people aren't gods, they're just people. And it made them all look a bit foolish. And so the Jews had very little difficulty in persuading or the consent of these people to hand them over, and the Jews stoned Paul in that city and then had his body dragged out, not for burial, but to expose it to the elements and to free the city from the impurity of its corpse. We read that the disciples surround Paul and he just gets up. Now, I think what we would have done, we thought, this is a bit hot here. Let's go home. Let's go all the way back to Antioch. This is just not really working out. But Paul is not like that. Paul goes straight back into the city, which he has been just stoned in, and he doesn't leave till the next day. And you think must have been awesome. These people had witnessed Paul being stoned, apparently killed, and then Paul walks back straight into the city. And from that time on, we don't seem to read of any real opposition to Paul. It's almost like he was bulletproof from this point on. It's almost like that occasion had given such awe to people that Paul was untouchable. And so they go to the next town called Derbe, even more remote than Lystra, and it appears that there were no Jews there either. And there they disciple and they evangelize, and then after that you think, well, we've done our bit. We weren't accepted in certain places, we were in some. We've done our work, let's just go home by the most direct way. But no, Paul doesn't do that. He goes back through every place that he visited, where he was persecuted, where he was not persecuted, retracing his steps to Lystra, Iconium and Antioch. And this is not just bravado, Paul just doing a sort of a kind of showing I'm really hard kind of thing. Paul is doing this to encourage the young churches there, to confirm the faith of the disciples. He loved them, he cared for them, and he was wanting what was best for them. He warned them that trouble was the normal lot for Christians, and it is today. There are those in this church who've lost friends, who endure difficult family relationships on account of their faith. Now, part of his work in strengthening the church was to install leaders there, those with spiritual maturity to guide and help, to instruct and encourage. And so he ordains them. And I think from the words that we're all congregational, well, as a Baptist church, congregational Baptist church we are, so I don't think we have any problem really taking the view that the original word was something which implied a kind of vote. We don't have to go that far, but there was consent from the church of choosing people who then were ordained and appointed by the two apostles themselves. And we can go back to Acts chapter 6, where the 7 so-called deacons are appointed there, to see that was a kind of pattern that seemed to happen. So, after that, they return to the coast, to the place where they come. They come back to Perga, where they'd first come to, and they take the ship back to Antioch, to the sending church. And there they convened and assembled the entire church to tell everyone what had happened and what great things God had done with them. The amazing things he had done. You'd have thought Paul could have said, well, it was really hard, we were stoned and, we had a lot of persecution. But this isn't apparently what Paul is. He is saying the Gentiles have received the gospel. There is a great work going on. Paul is not half empty or half full. He's 100% full. And it's not about them bigging themselves up. He tells not what they had done, but what God had done with them, how God had used them. Now, the journey had taken the best part of a year, perhaps longer. And you'd have thought they'd have thought, well, we perhaps need a bit of a holiday now. Perhaps I could even retire, Barnabas is thinking. But they're not like that. They resume their existing ministry in the church and carry on doing what they were doing. Now, that concludes Paul's first missionary journey. Now, as we have said, it was epoch-making. It was the first organised missionary endeavour. And it was an organised outreach to those without the truly knowledge of God. And as you could say, that with such a state of affairs, they lived happily ever after. But if we've learned anything from Acts so far, we can guess that probably next chapter, there's going to be some trouble ahead. And there is. And this is the constant cycle of Acts. There is blessing. There's trial. And more blessing. But you'll have to wait for another time for that. But in conclusion, what lessons can we learn? Paul's gospel was free. You wonder why the Jews were so virulent in their hostility to Paul. It was something more than that they just didn't believe in Jesus. It was the fact that Paul was offering salvation, Gentiles, without Judaism. That somehow Paul was bypassing the route that they were going through, that they didn't need to become Jews. that somehow he was denigrating their faith. And therefore, today we learn that when we become Christians, there are no preconditions before we become a Christian. There are some people who would actually make Christians adopt Jewish practices, and that is clearly wrong. But sometimes people have this idea that if you're going to become a Christian, if I'm going to become a Christian, there are certain steps you need to do first. There are no steps you need to do first. You need to come to Jesus just as you are. The next one is Paul had a gospel which was for all mankind without qualification. The gospel Paul preached was for all mankind. It was not limited to a certain nation, social group or ethnic group. And I dare say Paul, socially, let alone ethnically, had absolutely nothing in common with the people he met on these journeys. But that didn't hinder him preaching to them. And of course the lesson for us is the church isn't supposed to be a group from the same social bracket, but people from all backgrounds and all walks of life. All should be welcome here. We might consider others too posh, or too rough, or too rich, or too poor. They're too educated or not educated enough. In short, they're not our kind of people. But the church should be full of all sorts of people who are not our kind of people. The news of salvation through Jesus Christ is for all mankind. The next thing is, Paul believed in the church. Now, we've said that the book of Acts provides a backstory. It provides us all the essential details of how the early church operated. And we can't read Paul's letters without thinking about this. It might sound obvious, but our understanding of what we read in Paul's letters must be conditioned by what we read in Acts. And where the same things are mentioned in Acts or in the letters, they should give us a fuller understanding of what we read. So when we read from our passage that he preached and believed in Jesus, he founded churches and he appointed elders, those who would lead and guide and rule. Our view of the church is that the nature of it and the gifts that God gives to it must be understood in the light of what we read in Acts. We can't just invent new things from the epistles. We have to condition what we read in the epistles by what we read in Acts. But the things that we do read will teach us about what we should be as a fellowship. Those churches that Paul founded were congregations of those united by a common faith. They followed the teaching of the apostles. They met for fellowship. They met for prayer and the breaking of bread. Church was not a place which they attended when they had nothing more important to do, a place where they expected to be available if and when they needed it. It was a family, it was a society, it was a community that was an integral part of their lives, among whom they would find sanctuary and fellowship, even in persecution and trials, and their experiences of these would drive them closer together. And finally, Paul believed in the fellowship of the gospel. It was an amazing journey that Paul and Barnabas had gone on, and you thought, credit to them, they did it. But they don't look at it like that. When they come back to the church at Antioch, they say this is the work that God has done with them. The church had made a sacrifice in losing two of their best leaders for a best part of a year, but they'd done so willingly. Paul and Barnabas were not on a personal mission. They were doing it on behalf of the whole church of Antioch. The whole church was engaged in, and they willingly supported Paul, and they were thrilled to hear what Paul spoke about when they returned. And it is true in our church. Those who work for the church, whether in the Sunday school, the teens group, whether those who go in the open air on behalf of the church, they deserve our support because they are doing it on behalf of the whole church. You might not individually be able to do some of these things, but you can support the people who are. If you can't support it by action, you can do it by prayer. And you can do it by encouragement. So I suppose we end up with the question is, do we believe what Paul believed in? So we have our final hymn, and then I'll close in prayer. Hymn 359, To Him We Come.